normal because, again, the people we were socializing were pretty much in the same boat as us. So,
and by the time
I was small at the time, so.
And by the time you finished school and presumably went to the army, did you feel very much still a Russian Israeli, or were you
not quite? I was trying to recall how did I learn Hebrew, and I don't remember. It just came. So by the time I went to the army, it was pretty much like everyone else, and then university, of course, and doing reserve service in the middle. But it was no different than anyone else around me. And when I came here again, I didn't plan to stay here. It was just a nice way to spend a few years in London and stuff. Imperial College sounded like a good place. Being in central London, it's definitely better than Akron University in Ohio for this purpose. By the time I finished my PhD, which was 96, I was planning to go back, and I was looking for jobs in Israel at the same time, because nothing was immediately forthcoming. I could stay a bit longer being research associate and doing a postdoc. So I was hanging out at Imperial doing some work that was pretty much continuation of what I was doing before. And I was looking very much at jobs in Israel. I was in negotiations with Rafael, which is a state-owned defense contractor, quite big in Israel, possibly. And good as well, because if you think about Iron Dome, it's their baby.
Okay.
Among many other things, but they were very, very slow and sort of head counts and budgets like any big organization. And being 96, 97, it was quite popular for people who got PhDs from good university to work in the city. So I thought, okay, but by that time I pretty much was convinced that university is not the place where I want to spend the rest of my life.
Okay, and I'm just going to jump in just to allow you to speak about Israel as someone who's stayed here now and raised their children here. And I know, some of your children have been at Jewish schools, some of them not so. You've been affiliated to a synagogue. How does it feel for you being? How does it feel for you now being here, and attitudes to Israel and how you want to see Israel represented? Where is your heart? Where does your heart play out with that? I think we wanted to be sure to give our 4 households, as it were, the opportunity to speak about that just a little in the last few moments you have. Josie's going to be keeping timing of all our speakers, but I'm just helping you to share that with us, Michael.
I think it's pretty much in Israel still, because I'm much less interested in what's going on in the UK in terms of politics. And to be brutally honest, being a British citizen for the last 20 odd years, maybe 25 years, I think I pulled myself to go and vote only in the last 1 or 2 elections here. I think I'm still much more connected to Israel than.
Yeah, your heart's in Israel, both in terms politically and
that's right.
Huh. Okay. Josie, how are we doing with time? Because I jumping in to talk to Michael, I am not. Do we need to move over with your careful timing?
I think Michael's just about on course at the moment. So if you want to move to the next one, unless Michael's got any last minute things he wants to add.
So pretty much staying in the UK wasn't really planned. It just happened like this. And at the beginning, I was taking it 1 year at a time or whatever. And
how do you find the British Jewish relationship to Israel, and or indeed how you want to engender a love for Israel in your children, or just any thoughts on that before we go to Iris and Sid next?
We're going there very often, so my kids are very familiar with the country and with people around there. Obviously, last year we didn't go because of COVID, but yeah, so we used to go several times a year. Possibly I was going even more than that.
Okay, we'll have a chance to come back and have more of a conversation with everyone. But I think we're now going to, thank you so much, Michael. We're now going to move to Iris and Sid, who I think Josie has primed with the time that you have to kind of tell your story of how you both got to Israel and the decisions of leaving Israel, and how, and kind of where your heart and mind is around Israel and support for Israel now.
First of all, I have to apologize for being late and to say that I deleted what I had written when I thought I was printing it out to come in. So I'm finding this a little difficult. Hi, Dan and Shai. My two sons are here who were born and grew up in Israel and did the army in Israel and are now living here. So I'm so pleased that you're with me. Would you like me just to talk in a rather unfocused way or not talk, whatever you feel?
No, we want you and Sid. We've particularly chosen you all and your journeys to share with that. Yeah, absolutely.
So I apologize because we gave a talk a little while some time ago at a Beit Midrash meeting, didn't we, Adrian? I think it was. And so a lot of this may be repeated, but I'll be as quick as I can, keeping to the 8 minutes. Sid doesn't want to talk this evening. Okay, so, but we have thought it through together. Okay, so first of all, I have to say, I was born in 1939, the beginning of the war. I spent the war years, I think 1940, 41, we moved to Chipperfield, just north of London. That was my Yiddish-speaking grandparents, my 3 aunts, my parents, my uncles, and we were all together, 7 cousins at the end, in a tiny little cottage, which you wouldn't believe, but there you go. So one of my first languages was Yiddish. I have to say that in Chipperfield, I don't believe anyone had ever met a Jewish person before. And we were very careful not to, I remember this, my grandmother was not allowed to go out in the day in case somebody spoke to her, because stories were already coming from Poland, where my father's family came from. They didn't want anyone to know that we were a Jewish family. Only one other family there did find out and did know, and they were wonderful to us, I have to say. And the relationship continued after the war. After the war, we all came up back to London, moved back to London. And I went to Cheder 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, as people of my generation did. And I loved it, I have to say. I became one of the kids who led the younger kids on Shabbos for the service. It was a United Synagogue synagogue. Now, I believe my desire, my love, my whatever to be in Israel, commitment, began there because we had a book we learned Hebrew from. Some of you may remember it, of my age. It was called the Aleph Bet book, and on the front was the most beautiful picture of flat-roofed houses surrounded by palm trees and orange trees, a beautiful blue sea, and it was Israel. And we were quite a poor family, lived in a poor area above a shop, and that looked like heaven to me. Israel was heaven. By the time I got to 12 years old, I was saying to my mother, I want to go and live in Israel. And she contacted Habanim for me. And I think for me and Sid, Habanim was a Zionist, socialist education of which has sort of informed our lives and who and how we are from then until today. I became so committed. I became a movement worker when I was 16 after GCSE O-levels. I moved to the Habanim Beit, where I knew none of us went to university. It was too bourgeois. We had to be what was called Jewish labor, Avodah Yehudi, and go and work the land in Israel. And when I was 18, that's when I finished my A-levels. That's what I did and went. Now, everything on the kibbutz was like heaven, but not quite, because I began to have a few problems around, I would say, the politics, perhaps. We were a very, very strict, what would I say? We kept kuppah, we shared clothes, we shared everything that we had. Obviously, we ate in the Chadar Ochel and everything. But we had Palestinians who came, it was in the Galil, who came to work with us, and some of them lived on the kibbutz as well. But when it came to being members, they were not allowed to join. And I don't know today, I was asking recently why that was, whether it was from the Avodah movement or whether it was from the Jewish Agency, which I don't think they had that much influence on Mapai at that time. I was a Mapamnik, but Mapai. And that felt very uncomfortable to me, I remember. And a few of us were very involved with trying to get them to be allowed to be members. Like, after all, we were all socialists. That's why we were there. Yeah. So my first daughter was born on that kibbutz, and my two sons were born later, my two lovely sons and my daughter. We moved from the short stay in England. We were back for the 67-day war, the Six-Day War in 1967. And we moved to a moshav just outside Jerusalem, Bet Zayit, where my two boys and my eldest daughter grew up. And I think they would say, if they would say today, we had a wonderful life there, I think, in many ways. We worked on some of us, we were a chicken moshav and a mata'im, an orchard moshav, and we opened the first swimming pool for Jerusalem, which made money for the moshav, of course. And everything there seemed sort of fairly like we were in a bubble. We weren't really connected with the outside. But then gradually, I became more and more aware and more discomforted with what was going on with the occupation and how it was somehow becoming more and more brutal. As you've all met Bassam Aramin, he's been to the synagogue 3 times and has met people, most of you, many of you have anyway. He calls it the brutal occupation. He doesn't want to call it apartheid. And we gradually watched that happening. I joined, we both joined, anti-occupation groups, and we were very active in them. I was working at that time, I was a very qualified social worker, and I had my master's in epidemiology of mental health at the Hebrew University Hadassah Hospital, where I was also teaching. I mean, there were wonderful people in Israel, be sure of that, who really have I contacted Frank just before to ask him about liberal Judaism values. And he reminded me, and he said, thank you, Frank, so much, Rabbi Frank Elner. Yes, he said, when Hillel was asked to do the very thing you asked, he replied, that which is hateful to you, do not do to others. And that is something which allows me, I was asking about liberal Judaism values, and that allows us to connect with liberal Judaism today, and particularly the FPS and equality and the racial equality group and all of that. But we moved back here in 1990. We came for a year and we stayed. My boys were here, and so we stayed. Maybe you'd like to ask them how it's been for them as well. And I have grandchildren here and there, of course. What do I feel? Why did we stay? Well, I'd just like to say that one other thing that happened in Israel, which was wonderful. I joined the Shtulat Anashim, which Alice Shelby, some of you may know her book, Never a Native, which came out a couple of years ago. I was on her first Vadat Higui, which is the steering committee of hers, it's the most wonderful feminist and activist organization for women, Palestinian women and Jewish women living in Israel. And from that, myself and another member there managed to set up the first counseling center for women in Israel. At first, Palestinians joined us, and they said, no, Palestinian women, they had to put their energies elsewhere in their struggle. But today, every month, even now, the founder members, there are 8 of us, we still meet every month now on Zoom or on Skype Zoom. And we're getting a book together about our experiences in Israel then. So to sum up Israel, I had wonderful family experiences, wonderful social experiences, wonderful, you all know about Sid's, I believe, music and Israel, how well known he was and how much music he brought to Israel with himself and his band. We had 6 children there between us. I mean, he had 3 birth children, I had 3 birth children in our previous relationships. We have another 2 adopted children, adopted in Israel now as well. So we had wonderful, rich experiences, but I am so tired now. I feel so worn out, as I know so many people on the left in Israel feel about this struggle with this occupation. And a huge question for me today is how do we join that with liberal Judaism, which is so important to me as well, and looking to liberal Judaism values to help us somehow get out of this terrible, deteriorating situation. I don't know if you read Haaretz, any of you, but this week, 87 Israeli Palestinians were made homeless in the North Galil because their homes were demolished. That's children, women, and men, of course. That's within the state of Israel, Palestine, as we call it. So it's really scary. I feel guilty that we're not there involved in the fight, in the struggle to make it, because it's not only, I mean, all Israeli Jewish boys and girls suffer as well, be in the army and having to be involved in this. We have to help everybody there to get it. Was that telling me to stop? Sorry, to get into a better situation. I heard a ping, and that would be my wish, to the message and the wish I would like to share with you all.
Thank you, Iris. Someone who's lost their notes, you really conveyed that so beautifully and fluently, your journey to Israel. And am I right that what you're talking about, the pain of the occupation, contributed or informed you coming home as a family, that it felt too difficult to be there?
That is absolutely true. Sorry, my heart is beating like mad at the minute. Forgive me. And I'm not going to cry, okay? Yes, it is. And it's still a struggle.
Yeah.
You know? And I wouldn't want to leave my boys at any stage, and I don't know where they are with this, and my grandchildren. I couldn't bear to be without them either. they are here and there are those there, but I guess they feel the same way somewhere. You know, we all share a similar view. Yes, definitely. But is it right for us to, about any of us here today, what we used to call the armchair Zionists, forgive me, for, you know, for abandoning that struggle? We mustn't.
I think, thank you, Iris, and we'll have an opportunity for talking, and I'm going to hand over now, but in a way you capture that sense of aliyah as well as yurida. Aliyah, the going up to the land, and yurida, the coming down from the land, which brings difficulties for many of us, I think, living in the diaspora, of that sense of ascent, that is Israel the only place to live as a Jew? And that sense, certainly, that leaving Israel is a descent of some nature. No doubt that will be part of our conversation. So thank you both. And I'm now going to pass over to Abigail and David. I don't know how you're going to do this together, but I hand over to you. Well done, Iris. That was beautiful.
So, by the way, Abigail is looking at me from the other room. I think she thinks that I will start, right?
Okay.
Okay, so I will start. My travel to Israel started with my parents. I was born in Israel. And I was born in a neighborhood like many other neighborhoods where the vast majority of the children around me were children of Holocaust survivors. So the anomaly somehow seemed the normal thing. It wasn't until much later that I began to understand how far from normality this was and is. Because we have only a few minutes, and I guess, Josie, you will flash your eyes when you tell me your time is over. No, actually, I will hand it to Abigail before. As a child, I remember, as Amos Oz so beautifully describes it in his tale of darkness and love, gratefulness for having a state, for having a country. I was born to a country, so I for me it was not something that was evident, but I do remember from my parents and from adults around me that very, very strong awareness, which was almost a daily entity. Also the very simplicity is perhaps a word that is trying to hide general poverty. In the late 50s, early 60s, everyone had very little, and the same very little, very, very little. And there wasn't any sense of distress or lacking one's real needs. So aside from the impact of the Holocaust that came sneaked in, I discovered that my mother went through the Holocaust full menu only later, and because the plan was to hide it from me, which I think was common to many families, to the decision to raise children normally, to raise normal people. But despite of that, there was a sense of I guess the word is, we are allowed to say happiness. And a part of it was a sense of togetherness, of solidarity, of very strong solidarity. And for me, the loss of it, what I feel and lived as a gradual deterioration in that solidarity, was a part of what I feel is a very sad process that Israel went through. Later, when I went to the army, because I was an only child, the rule was, still is, I think, that an only child cannot go to a combatant unit. So I was put in the army's psychological processing of looking at candidates for the army, which was an opportunity, or it is how and why I came to see much wider spectrum of Israeli families and cultures, and for the first time, which was quite a lesson. I was contaminated, that's not a very good word to use nowadays, sorry. But I was a musician, a doomed musician, I guess, before I knew it. And I joined the Jerusalem Academy of Music. I was lucky enough to be able to study in the academy during the army, even before the status of outstanding musician was created, which is something Abigail was, I think, among the first women to get, but that was a part of what I was lucky to have. I decided to, Iris, you lost your notes, and my notes were never made. I decided to just, let myself go with associations, because in few minutes to talk about something which is so essential, I didn't see any other way. Another strong element was that the anomaly of the conflict, the wars, the hostility, was again, like in my early childhood, the Holocaust, the normal. So again, an example of something which is totally not normal or distorted, felt like a normality, and until '67, until the occupation, the situation which became very acutely clear that the narrative around was by surrounding countries to eliminate Israel was unifying, a very unifying force that put different sides of the Israeli society together. That, of course, if we forget, as Abigail says, depends where do you start to look at history. The fact that Israel came to being at the expense of many Palestinian interests, lives, essentials, etc. But that sense of it was a part of the phenomenon of solidarity, of strong solidarity. I guess, looking at the watch, that I have to now go to how we went out, and we went out both because I was invited to pursue a doctoral project in Paris, and Abigail, which was a much more rare and strong event, was invited to study the flute in Paris with a scholarship of excellence from the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But something that I don't want to leave out, which was a part of my studies, is the total informality of support I got. My master's supervisor, the vast majority of the supervision sessions were in our very, very small kitchen, about as large as this study, between pasta and soup that we prepared, and that was a seriously serious supervision, but that's how it went. And then the person who really shaped a lot of what I then was trying to develop and was my PhD supervision, mainly her way of supervising was to call very early Saturday morning with a burning thing that she had. How could you write such nonsense? And that evolved to 4 hours Saturday morning thing. And I miss it. I miss a lot these non-formal and care and total devotion in personal relations. This is still something that we find in Israel and is very precious. And then we traveled to Paris for 7 years, I think. Abigail knows exactly to the day, but I think it's around 7 years. We came back to Israel both because Abigail had very wonderful opportunities to work and to develop things in Israel. My father fell ill, and we lived in Israel. You see, I was almost about to say here. The here and there, apropos your question, Rebecca, earlier, going to and from are sometimes fusing. We went back to Israel for 7 years, and then both because opportunities, it's a tricky word, possibilities to do things which are very precious presented themselves here, and by here I mean now in England. I started to work in London actually even before we went from Paris back to Israel, and it got intensified while we were in Israel. And then I started to work for the Guildhall, but the real link to the UK went when Yehudi Menuhin came to a concert I gave, and thank God the organizer didn't tell me before the concert that Yehudi will be there. She just told me, I have a funny old friend who loves music and he wanted to come and will come and see you after the concert. And after the concert he walked in and said, what are you doing next Wednesday? And of course I said nothing. And he said, well, you come to my school. I want to see whether you can teach what you've just done. And that was the push to come here and settle here, work in a more
David, can I mean, honestly, we could be listening to each one of you tonight for the whole time, and I realize it's ambitious to have asked a few of you to speak. Does this feel right to hand over to Abigail now, to let Abigail, and then maybe both of you will talk about living here and how that feels. I think Shabbat morning, we're going to hear a little bit from Abigail of her childhood when Tom Dolan, their son, will interview them. So we'll interview Abigail, but Abigail, can we pass to you now, just so we have time for everyone to speak?
So I was born in Jerusalem. My parents came from Morocco in the 50s separately as young, when they were quite young. So it's a very different family story than the one David just told. So I grew up in Jerusalem. I studied at the Jerusalem Academy. Then we moved to Paris because I had this opportunity to study there. We moved back to Israel. And in these years we had after the time in Paris, we were very busy professionally, and we based on traveling. So then there was a sense of feeling how Israel felt very small and isolated for us as musicians, and from there Europe seemed like a unified big entity that has presented many opportunities for us as musicians. And then there was a possibility for me to do a PhD in the UK. David was traveling. Daniel was born in traveling so much became impossible for us as a family, and that's how we moved to the UK. But it was never a decision to leave Israel. It just happened, and I didn't really think. I thought that I'm going to do a PhD and then we'll come back to Israel, and it just life developed in a way that we found ourselves here, and our children are here. So I feel very, very connected to Israel. I mean, the first thing I do in the morning is to scan Haaretz. And so there is a connection, a very strong connection to family, to friends. So the sense of history for me as a person is very strongly in Israel. At the same time, our life is here, home is here. Our children feel both Israeli and British. So it's a complex identity. It's there are wonderful things to say about Israel, but we feel sorts of criticism growing over the years of what's happening there. Israel, that David remembers. So David is 11 years older than me, so there's this gap between us. He tells our children a slightly different story about Israel than I remember. And the Israel we see now is very different from Israel that we remember as we live there as an adult. So Israel is changing very, very rapidly. I don't know if it's we are getting older or Israel is changing very rapidly. But things are different, very different from what I remember. Sorry?
How do you feel about that change? Being here, waking up in your home here and immediately scanning Haaretz and, positioning yourself facing Israel. How do you feel about the change?
Very, very strong anxiety, growing anxiety and worry and Israel is changing and not for the best. And it's very, very worrying. I don't want to get political.
No, but we're talking about matters of the heart.
Yes.
I think it's so interesting for us who've known you as a family for so long to know that it was music that brought you here.
Yeah.
Most definitely that, plucked you away from Israel and brought you here.
Yeah, it was never a decision to leave Israel, and to some extent we might go back at later stage in life. We are very, very connected, but home is here. I don't know. It's complex, and
I can understand that.
Yeah,
definitely.
What else to say? I don't know what else to.
I think there'll be room for questions. I imagine people are going to want to ask questions. I'm going to turn to John now, who is our last speaker, and to share that same question. How did your family make it there? I mean, when John's mother, Ray, died, and we all attended the Shiva, John, I think many of us were just overwhelmed by Ray's story of the life she had. And I know I was not alone in finding her journey so extraordinarily moving. So turning to you now, will you talk a little bit about how you ended up how you arrived there, or how you were there, and how you came here?
Okay. Well, two things. By the way, I like Abigail. The first thing I do in the morning is look at Haaretz. It's my homepage on my web browser. So I can only give a synoptic sort of view of a bit of my history. I was born in Jerusalem in 1951, and I lived for the first 9 years of my life in a place called Shikun Kiryat Moshe, which is opposite the convention center and near the Institute for the Blind, Beit Ivrim. My father emigrated to Israel in 1934. He was very active in the Zionist movement in Poland. He also learned in a school system called Tarbut, which was quite popular in Eastern Europe at that time, where the language of instruction was Hebrew. And he graduated from there, and then emigrated to Israel initially to pursue studies at the Hebrew University, which at the time was in Mount Scopus, and he became president of the student union there. And then went on to have a career, got his doctorate at Jerusalem University in literature, and went on to have a career as an educator, both in the army and in civilian life. My mother who's an Australian, was an Australian, she passed away last year, served in the Australian Air Force during the Second World War, following which she worked with survivors of the Holocaust in Europe and arrived in Israel on the Pan York, which is an illegal ship bearing Holocaust survivors. She met my dad in Camp Marcus in Haifa. It was an army camp dedicated to rapidly teaching new immigrants Hebrew. You could say it was a kind of an army-style ulpan. And the initial meeting was strange because she mistook him for the camp's gardener, where in fact he was a commanding officer. Dad used to dress like a schlep, whether he was in or out of uniform. And they married in 1949, and 2 years later I was born. My memories of Israel in my early years, I left Israel for England in 1960, I'll get back to it, are many and varied, too many for this occasion. But I think that overwhelmingly my life was shaped at that time by the fact that Israel had come into existence only 3 years before I was born. So vivid memories of things like, I recall things like the early Independence Day, military parades that used to take place in Jerusalem in those early years of the state, passing by the convention center. I remember myself and my brother and my father and my mother standing on the side watching. And the thing that used to impress me was how deep the imprints the tanks left on the asphalt of the road as they passed by. Some of my favorite children's stories that I used to read had to do with the War of Independence. There was a lot of that kind of literature around. I remember being ushered into the nursery building in the gun and out of the playground when I was about 5 because some bullets had hit the playground sandbox. I think that might have been around the time of the 56 Sinai. And I remember things like the frequent broadcasts on Israeli radio about survivors of the Holocaust, looking for each other. If you have information about so-and-so, can you please get in touch with so-and-so? Something along those lines. But I have a lot of memories, but these are some of the things that really stand up as I thought about it. At any rate, at the age of 9, I found myself on the way to England because my father had been asked to open up, to start a youth and a chalutz department at the London office of the Jewish Agency. And he stayed and be there for a stint of 2 years, after which he actually came back to Israel, and my mother and the two of us stayed over here. I actually vividly recall the day I arrived in England because it was the day the world learned that Adolf Eichmann had been captured. And I remember coming down, we were still on the way to London. I remember coming down, bed and breakfast we were staying at, and looking at a picture of Eichmann splashed on a large across the front page of some newspaper. And I could also see, although I was 9, that my father, he was very agitated. So when I asked him who this person was, he said a very bad man, and he left it at that. After about a year in England, my brother and I were sent to a Jewish boarding school called Carmel College, where I remained until university. Now, a couple of things about Carmel. Carmel was it was a kind of a cocoon, it was a very sheltered place. And if I think back on my life, in this regard, one very important thing stands out. That between the school and my home life on vacation, I grew up in such a way that when I hit the university, it was a kind of an explosion because I could not have known more than about 5 to 10 people who were not Jewish. In those years, except for 1964, I left Israel in 1960. I visited Israel again in 1964. But after that, I never came back to Israel or visited Israel until 1994. So I was really isolated from an Israeli community. I was in a completely Anglo-Saxon school with no Israelis, hardly any Israelis except my brother and myself. So it was a very kind of sheltered existence. But during my time at Carmel, despite my parents' very secular outlook, I myself chose to become very Orthodox. I used to go to synagogue for Shacharit, Mincha, Mariv. I became immersed in Jewish thought, not the Gemara, but I remember studying the Shulchan Aruch quite carefully. I ate only kosher, I wore kippah everywhere, I learned Tulane, and I also taught my headmaster's son his bar mitzvah at that time. And I was an ardent Zionist. from afar. I was riveted by the Six-Day War in 1967. I remember that day as if it was yesterday. And then came Sussex University, where I'd been accepted to read law, and spent my first year living at the local university-oriented Hillel House. At that point, I was still what one would call a strictly observant Jew. My Zionist views, I think, must have had an impact, because shortly after arriving at Sussex, there was a convention of some sort of the IUJF, which was the Inter-Universities Jewish Federation at the time, it was called that. And I was elected to be the organization's Israel officer. But midway through the year, I encountered what I would consider to be a defining turning point in my life. As Israel officer and at a local level, I was charged with organizing the Jewish Society's Israel Week at Sussex. And I organized it. It was a big exhibition. I got a lot of the exhibits from London for my trip to London. I used to occasionally go to London to the offices there, because Sussex, of course, is in Brighton. And I organized it. It was an exhibition on the second floor of the student building. We had an exhibition area populated with large displays and just outside that area, we put out a literature table, which I staffed with others. Now, what happened then was really quite something. I was really beset by a group of pro-Palestinian activists, members of the International Socialists, now known as the Socialist Workers' Party, by the way. And we had intense discussions, which lasted, I think, 3 days. These socialists came to argue with me. And this was really my first time that I had sort of broken out of a very sheltered sort of existence and confronted a wider world of political activists, people who were not Jewish, and so on. It was mind-blowing. Now, nothing was decided that week. I mean, I strongly defended our position. They strongly defended those. Interestingly enough, throughout, it was an intense but civil discussion. That's one thing that struck me. But it got me thinking. And over the next few weeks, I decided to change my major from law to philosophy. I also began to listen and read what these socialists had to say, trying to figure out their angle. It didn't make any sense. They seem to have such progressive views on so many things. And you've got to remember, this is 68, 69. Remember, these were the years of the Vietnam War. The student uprising of 68 had just happened, and its aftermath was everywhere, including the student union, whose elected leadership was in the hands of the socialists. This was also a decade of the civil rights movement in the United States, the women's movement internationally. They were very, very turbulent times. And these socialists, the more I read their literature, the more I came to identify with their positions, except on the state of Israel. And here, there was a crisis for me, because I recall this as if it was yesterday. I posed the question as follows. Either these socialists were right on the big social questions and were also right on Israel, in which case I was wrong, or I had to be open to the fact that I was wrong, or they were wrong about Israel, anti-Semitic really, and in that case, all their other positions were suspect. You could not, I argued at the time, be a racist, an anti-Semite, and at the same time accommodate genuinely progressive ideas about a host of other issues. And then it came down to this. Could you be an anti-Zionist and at the same time not be an anti-Semite? Because up to that point, for me, being an anti-Zionist meant being anti-Jewish, being anti-Semitic. I recall making a decision to fight it out by myself, and I took a day off from studies. I went away from everywhere. I went into the countryside. I spent the whole day. People must have, if anyone saw me, they must have thought I was mad, but I really isolated myself. I walked in lanes in the country, no one there, arguing aloud for and against the issue. And at the end of the day, I came to a decision. I came to the decisions that the socialists were most probably right. that you could be anti-Zionist and at the same time not be anti-Semitic. That was a big question, the decisive question for me. Looking at it from today's standpoint, I think it was much easier to separate out the issues than it is today. Today, anti-Zionism has become something of a trope for being anti-Semitic. And it is the case that a good deal of the left speaks with anti-Semitic overtones now, which was not the case, I believe, when I was in university. At any rate, having made that decision, I acted upon it. I resigned my position as Israel officer in the IUJF midterm, and I joined the Socialists. And that's where, as a political activist, I pretty much parked myself for the next 25 years until 1994. There's a whole story there, but I don't have the time for that. Suffice it to say, I worked for 12 years in the United States. I worked on production lines in Ford, in General Motors, in Kenworth Trucks, being a union activist and so on. But in 1994, for various reasons, I made a decision to go back to Israel. And there I stayed until the year 2000, and during which time I met my wonderful wife, Josie, over the internet in 1996. She came over to Israel in December of that year, and we pretty much got together soon afterwards. Today, I'm not active politically, but I still look at the big social issues with the worldview of a Marxist, and a Marxist who embraces his Jewish culture, and heritage, but nonetheless a Marxist. Now, how does it bear on my views of Israel today? There's definitely been a huge evolution. I mean, early on, I genuinely believed that by establishing the state of Israel, Jews had historically set themselves up a ghetto, but on a world scale. They had fought for a Jewish state out of the belief, which I also think was arrived at by people like Herzl, that anti-Semitism was endemic to human nature, or was so endemic that it could not be gotten rid of. And the only way out of it was to have our own state, whatever the cost, so that we could be masters and mistresses of our own destiny. My view in those years was to fight for a secular state where Palestinian Jews could live together in harmony. I no longer hold that view. I definitely do not believe that anti-Semitism is inherent to human nature any more than I believe that racism as such is endemic to human nature, or that patriarchal societies will exist forever or have existed forever. But I do believe that in today's world, with its increasingly polarized politics, the growing social crisis and increasing anti-Semitism that goes with it, itself a product of specific socioeconomic and historical conditions that are not an eternal attribute of human nature, that we Jews need our own home and our own country. But I also believe it must be a country that is based on social justice, and in the first instance, a modern state based on liberal concepts. This means, and I will conclude it by saying just the following. First and foremost, I think absolutely the first thing that has to happen, if there is going to be an end to what I consider to be a downward spiral in Israel, the ending of the occupation and supporting of a two-state solution. There is no two ways about it. Palestinians are a nationality, and they're an oppressed nationality, and they are oppressed by Israel in ways that will have already and will continue to tear ever more deeply Israeli society. It brutalizes Israeli society. It corrupts the morals of Israeli society. It's impossible for that not to happen. The fact that we as a Jewish people are daily oppressing another people is a cruel irony of history. A lot of people have said it. I dearly believe it. Second, I think we need to bring about the complete separation of state and religion. And only by doing so can we forestall what is happening right now, which is a tendency towards a theocratic concept of the state. By 2040, it is estimated that Hasidic population in Israel will constitute about 40% of Israel's population. That's a sobering thought, particularly in light of what is happening right now. And of course, we need to fight for social justice within Israel, against racism within Israel, for women's rights. We have political parties in Israel that participate in the Knesset that do not allow women to run for office. That's inconceivable. I think also that Israel today happens within the framework of Western countries, is one of the most racist countries in the Western world. And that has to be fought with, primarily seeking alliances within Israel, alliances between Jews and Palestinians, wherever possible, including points of cultural intersection, between Caucasian Jews and Ethiopian Jews, because there's a big tear there. And I could go on. My current connection with Israel, what is it right now? Well, I have family in Israel. I read the Haaretz every day. I am an avid reader of Hebrew literature. And I have also recently volunteered as a typist for the Ben Yehuda project, which is a massive project, literary project in Israel that's internet-based, aimed at reproducing every single work since the medieval ages in Hebrew that is non-religious and that is out of print.
Amazing.
And I'm right now typing from scanned pages a book, which, by the way, I consider to be a crappy book, but nevertheless, for researchers, a very interesting book about a very bad history of the War of Independence of 1948.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, John. Likewise, we could really have a whole evening. And I think it's testament that Zoom fatigue has not hit us tonight in the same way it normally does, because it has just been extraordinary listening to the five of you speaking. You've all brought such different things, and to finish, John, with that passionate, just extraordinary. Many of you have shared things that we haven't known, and what matters to me so much is that we as a community are able to hear each other's stories and opinions. Now, I'm well aware that we are almost at 8:45, and we generally always put a cap of our Zoom Beit Midrash meetings at, an hour and a quarter or something. But with Adrian's permission, I'm going to suggest that if any of you have questions that you want to put to our speakers, that you do so. We've had one already from Mash. Mash has joined our community as a friend, and you haven't joined officially as a friend, but you have been part of our community, coming along to events as an active Muslim who appreciates our Jewish community and is interested to learn. And Mash has asked all our speakers, what are the biggest issues facing the relationship between Israel and the diaspora? I'm going to just ask that question, Mash, and I am going to ask the Dolans, who I felt in the middle was squashed rather, but it's open to any of you to jump in.
Well, there's an ongoing debate in Israel to what extent Jews in the diaspora are allowed to express opinion.
Yeah.
Because they are there and we are here. We are Israelis. We are here and there's this say, kind of quoting from some kind of דברים שרואים מכאן לא רואים משם, or something that you can see from here, you can't see from there, etc. And the other way around. So, and at the same time, there is a sense that diaspora Jews have to stand for Israel. And it's a sense of duty because there's a recognition of the special relationship. And of course, this position doesn't make sense, but many Israelis won't see it that way. And since I came to the UK, I realized that I came to develop the view that it's the duty of us Israelis, but also the Jewish community in the diaspora, to say out loud what we really think about Israel and the way Israeli society is managed. And it's not that we have the right, we have the duty to express this view. And Israelis wouldn't like it, wouldn't like to hear it, but I think we must do it. And yeah.
At Limud this year, I now do not have his name in front of me, a general that spoke about how critical he finds it. And yes, he was on the left of the spectrum, but how critical he finds the diaspora relationship, and welcomes, encourages, invites Israel to both listen to the diaspora and the diaspora to keep talking. But as you say, Abigail, that is not always the same. Yeah.
I must say that I find it very difficult to see many of my friends who are, for any other context in Israel, stand out for their liberal views. When it comes to Israel, they feel intimidated. They feel as if they have no rights to express their views. And I don't think they fully realize how damaging it is for Israel, and how difficult it is for the liberal groups in Israel who are fighting for their lives now as political entities, not to be supported by their peers, and how liberal Jews who wouldn't hesitate to support liberal cause elsewhere become silent when it comes to Israel.
Okay.
Can I just say very briefly that I find the concept of diaspora difficult. I reject that concept, because I think that Jews who were born in England or any other country are not in exile, and diaspora means exile. They're just born in England or in the United States.
John, that's exactly the point I was going to make. Thank you for making it. And may I just say to both Abigail and yourself, what a pleasure it has been, to hear you both. It's really a pleasure. Mm-hmm. And it's great that you're my grandson's teacher for his bar mitzvah.
and just one final thing, taking up on Abigail's thing. I have absolutely no problem in any Jew or anyone making any comment about Israel policies or politics any more than I have a problem about commenting on South African politics or US politics or British politics or French politics. I don't think we should feel guilty about making comments about what's happening in Israel.
Okay.
They get intimidated, John. I don't, you don't, but other people do, because the self-hating Jew list. I mean, I was on it, for saying things, trying to talk out.
Okay, I'm going to try and go to the other question that we have, and I'm going to call on David and Michael to respond to this. What do our speakers think of the Abraham Accords? And that's from John Norman, I'm presuming.
What? From my side, I think it's very good.
Do you want to say something about it, just to share what it is, just in case?
It's a great example of what some people call peace for peace, or effectively when people want to live in peace with each other without looking for a reason to fight, they can always find it. So I think from my point of view, I'm very supportive of it.
Oh, sorry, I'm muted. Thank you. David.
Sorry, I didn't fully understand your question. The question was about?
John, would you like to ask it? I presume it's from you, just to give it a bit of nuance. Am I right?
Hello. Yes, the question is, what do the participants think of the Abraham Accords?
Abraham Accords.
זה ההסכמי שלום עם מדינות ערב שעשה ביוזמת טראמפ.
Oh, I see. It's a tricky one. There is, of course, a lot of positive element there, because hopefully, because of the force of life, it will spread, and מתוך שלא לשמו יבוא לשמו, even if it was not meant as a genuine peace cause, it might bring, simply because people will start to meet each other and see the devilish side of the other, as with capital O. But I think that the cynicism that was behind it, which manifests itself in actually existential threat against Israel, because a part of the deal was Netanyahu okaying Donald Trump selling F-35. I'm a musician, I'm not a military expert, but I read without any exception experts of military affairs that these weaponry is a threat to the existence of Israel. Once going to the hands of those who will want to use it as such. And as we know, the Middle Eastern logic of stability, which means lack of it, this is far from being impossible. So the first association I have with this business is a sheer fear that the superiority of Israel when it comes to
defending itself,
ability to run a war with weaponry.
I'm just going to jump in just to check it, that the Abraham Accords were the accords of creating peace between the Arab Emirates and Israel, brokered by the US with the ceremony in August. So
I think I was referring to there's several countries, so it's not just the Emirate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am referring to that on a larger scale, the peace accord with Morocco, for example. Again, it's complex because in reality, relations or normalization, going towards normalization with between Israel and Morocco started to take place. That was linked with the US under Trump recognizing a disputed territorial claim of Morocco is, something that is sneaked in from the back door, which is a problem. But it's a complex one because the possible positive element is there. I think that the cynicism behind is greater than lack of it, greater than genuine search for war. But when it comes to this specific element of these accords, in exchange of allowing these hugely financially rewarding for the Americans sale of the F-35, I think that Israel is not in a better position.
I think F-35, it's a little bit over the story of F-35 to Abu Dhabi is a little bit overblown because Israel will remain superior simply due to the avionics which Israel uses for the platform itself. I think it's less important. And secondly, it's very hard to see how Israel could prevent US from selling US technology to whoever they want.
So there are 2 points here. The first one, again, I am a musician. I know what I'm talking about when it comes to Beethoven sonatas, not to weaponry. But I read people who are military experts, and many of them, except when it comes to opinions which are linked to political agenda, when it comes to non-Israeli military experts, that's what I read. So that's the only thing I can,
I think it's.
Can I just say that using the word peace process here,
the story. The head of Israeli Air Force came up just a few days ago saying that he is quite relaxed.
Can I just say that I think that using the word, the combination of words peace agreement with these countries is to some extent laundering words, because relationship with Morocco are there for years. Israelis were traveling to Morocco, visiting. The relationship are warm and existing, and to say that there is a state of war between Israel and these countries is completely wrong. The state of war and the acute conflict is with the Palestinians and the countries that are surrounding Israel. These remote countries are simply not in war with Israel, and so this peace accord, is meaningless.
I don't quite agree with Abigail on that, because I agree with the situation about Morocco. I completely agree with what Abigail is saying about Morocco, but the Emirates and the other stuff and the snow, even if the motives are completely cynical, what is happening on the ground is positive because it widens the political space for operating. And for me, the issue is political in this sense, that it allows Israelis to meet up with and get together with citizens of other Arab countries that was not possible before. And that is positive, that is good. And so whatever the motives were and whatever the complications are in terms of the military aspect, politically, in terms of widening the political space for action, for activity, and for enabling citizens of different countries that have hardly spoken to each other for decades to meet up and talk and converse and discuss, I think that is positive, because the beginning of all wisdom is in these situations is to actually get together across the barriers and start talking to each other. That's good.
The problem is that
I'm going to close this question because it sounds like there's agreement amongst some, and I'm just going to go to the last question that brings us back more to the issues that we were beginning with. I think I understand, Mike, your question, that you are asking a question which was given direct to me. Is there a danger that an anti-Israel sentiment, which can manifest itself in anti-Semitism, and John spoke about that, or not, can drive our children, I'm not sure what you mean drive our children to, but can affect our children, I'm thinking, who may experience this in their world, in their school scenarios, and when they are trying to see Israel as a safe haven. Mike, have I conveyed your question? Because that seems an interesting one about our children.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say in a fairly candid way, I was really building upon something that John said earlier about the discourse that he had with, I think it was SWP members at university, and how that it sounded like a robust, but effectively a civil discourse. And I really wonder, well, I know that doesn't happen now. You know, I know from friends, I've seen it reported in the media.
Yeah.
I've seen it reported on social media. I've seen videos of Jewish kids who are having an incredibly hard time, not because of classic anti-Semitism, but because of a kind of new type of anti-Semitism, which is incredibly painful to talk about if you're on the left, but it's there. And it manifests itself particularly in, I've heard some terrible reports from universities like SOAS, for example, you know, where any kind of pro-Israeli sentiment is effectively hounded, and kids have been hounded. And I worry, and I guess listening to some of the thoughts tonight, I worry that when Jonah goes to university, and Jonah has some sort of quite strong sentiments around Israel, when he goes to university, it's just going to be 3 years of anxiety for us, thinking, how is that going to manifest itself? And I guess the kind of the macro question is what appears to be an incipient and growing movement against Israel for all sorts of very good reasons is actually going to, in a way, radicalize Generation Z Jewish kids to say, do you know what? I don't have any place in our society. They don't like us. And therefore, Israel is a safe haven, I think, which has been the word that's been used before. I'm just trying to look at it from their perspective. So yeah, I guess that's what I was trying to say.
Okay, interesting. I'm aware it's 9 o'clock, but I would love to hear a couple of responses from our speakers on that. David and Iris. David, who has a child at university right now, so that's of interest.
I think that you're talking about when criticism, which is linked to straightforward thinking, what John described as an intense but civilized conversation. By that I mean it includes listening to the other and talking to the point, turns to hatred. You are talking about hatred, and hatred is a poison that is one of the most dangerous ones, of course. And dealing with hatred is the question. Anti-Israeli hatred or anti-whatever, racial-based, sexuality-based, this is hatred. And being very, clear, looking straight into the eyes of these, and being, non-apologetic and not retrieving, but taking action against it is the answer. Criticism of Israel and myself too. The emotional home of mine is still my friends there, and my memories from there, and my love to Israel, with the criticism I have on the process or what's going on there. But this is not anti-Israeli criticism. This is straightforward hatred, which is as seriously dangerous as all other kind of hatred. And in that respect, it's not very different from anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is irrational, is a form of hatred. And what you are talking about, Michael, is also a form of hatred.
Thank you, David.
I absolutely agree as well. It's very well.
Yeah, I was going to ask Michael, because he has Adam at University in St. Andrews too, but Iris was waiting. So Michael, if I can just let Iris say something, and then you have the final word.
Okay, I'll be quick. Okay, I have two grandchildren at university, and both of them, and one's an Israeli, here in England, are saying that they haven't met in their one's at Cambridge, one's at Newcastle, haven't met this. I'm not denying it, because it's clear that there is an issue. I'm trying to remember when I was active in anti-apartheid in the 50s and the 60s, and we were, talking to a white South African or being with a white South African was horrible. It might have been a perfectly nice man, I don't know, but, we couldn't do it. Or we tried not to. It was blind, I'm trying to think, can we think of any other way to address this? Can we help to, it's not anti-Semitism, and we must not stop people criticizing Israel, but we also don't want it to hijack by anti-Semitism.
Sure. And David captured that sometimes there's critique and sometimes there's hatred dressed up as critique. Michael, would you like to say something? Because you've got Adam at University St. Andrews in Scotland.
No, I just wanted to say that I absolutely agree with what David said, and he put it very, very well. It is hatred, and this sort of hatred is a new form of anti-Semitism. The good old anti-Semitism, just put in a in a way that it's socially acceptable in these days.
No.
Okay.
Criticism is fine, but very often the criticism is being driven by hatred rather than specific criticism about something
Yeah, and I think what you and David are saying, that we can generally we can identify the two. I think it's time to finish tonight. I'm really pleased that we have next week, and next week is really going to be about how important it is to be in the room and to be part of conversations. All of you have spoken so extraordinarily, personally, and with such great informative ways that you have spoken to us. John, Iris, with Sid, I know Sid contributed to that, Michael and Abigail and David, thank you so much. I think our community is so profoundly fortunate to both have folk like you who are prepared to share, but also to be a community that wants to listen in this way. So I'm not going to say much more other than thank you. Thank you to you who spoke. Thank you to you who came. We know that evenings like these are all the better for having folk with us, asking questions. Adrian's popped in the chat the Our Israel Between Wrestling and Embracing, and Leah Mulstein will be leading on that, and really will be sharing some very interesting experiences of her chairship of Artseinu. So look forward to see you next Thursday, and of course for Shabbat, and thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca and Adrian and Josie and everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Josie, for priming all our speakers as well. That was hugely helpful.
Yes, yes, very supportive.
Everyone, thank you.
Thank you.